study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. But shun profane and vain babblings, for they will increase unto more ungodliness. Hello, I'm Pastor Gervais Charmley. Welcome back to Bethel Evangelical Free Church Hanley on YouTube. In this video, Christmas is coming, the goose is getting fat, and so on, but is the goose really a sinister pagan symbol? And is Christmas really a pagan festival? Here are questions that, if nowhere else, get raised all over the internet at this time of year. I know Christians who shun Christmas because they are convinced that it is in fact some great pagan thing. And this is very largely down to this absolutely dreadful book, The Two Babylons, or The Papal Worship Proved to be the Worship of Nimrod and His Wife, by the late Rev. Alexander Hislop. Well, first of all, who was Alexander Hislop? Alexander Hislop was a Free Church of Scotland minister. He was born in 1807 and he was ordained to the ministry in 1844. He was ordained to the East Free Church Arbroath, and he remained there as pastor until his death in 1865. He had at one point been a journalist, and that very much comes out in this book. His prose is journalistic, to put it mildly. The book was originally published in 1853 as a fairly brief pamphlet, and was rewritten and enlarged in 1862, and so published just a few years before his death. And the whole thesis of the book is explained here. It is the papal worship, that is Roman Catholic worship, equals the worship of Nimrod and his wife. That Roman Catholicism, in fact, is not Christianity in any sense of the word, but is actually a thinly disguised paganism. That is the argument of this book. Or rather, it is the assertion of this book, because although he says it is proved, it isn't. He begins with this postulate and works through it. It is a highly speculative work. And it is a work that rests upon a number of highly questionable assumptions. For example, that all pagan worship develops from the worship of Nimrod and his wife. Secondly, that all pagan gods are really Nimrod, and all pagan goddesses are really his wife. Thirdly, that similarity is identity, or at least similarity suggests identity. So that if there are two pagan gods who are supposed to have the same sort of sphere of influence, then they must originally have been the same god. And thirdly, that the fourthly, that the Nimrod of Genesis is the Ninus of Greek mythology. Now, who was Nimrod? It's a good question. Nimrod is a figure who is mentioned very, very briefly indeed in Scripture in the 10th chapter of the book of Genesis. Nimrod, chapter 10, from verse 8. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Out of that land went forth Ashur, and builded Nineveh, and the city Rehoboth, and Calah, and so on. That's all we're told about Nimrod in Scripture. We're told that he is the founder, if you will, of Babel, but also he's linked with Nineveh. Now, Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. And in about 400 BC, Greek chroniclers were trying to write the history of the known world, and they didn't really know the history of Nineveh. They didn't know the history of the Assyrian Empire. They listened to myths and legends floating around, and there were a lot of legends floating around concerning a woman called Semiramis. Well, that's the Greek version of her name. She was in fact a regent of Assyria between 811 and 808 BC. However, she'd been quite well known and celebrated, and as often happens, she became, in terms of legend, unstuck in time. She became a legendary figure. People didn't know where she came from or who she was, but they linked her with various ancient kings and such like. Herein was part of the problem. Also, she had a bit of a reputation of having built important buildings, and so it came to be that if a big building was seen, a ruin was seen, oh, Semiramis built that. Now, there's a tower in the city of Chester that is known as the Agricola Tower or Caesar's Tower. Unfortunately, the tower's actually medieval. It's much later than the Romans, but it was forgotten that it was medieval, and its great masonry led people to think, oh, this has to be Roman. Well, similar things happened with some of the buildings associated with Semiramis, and so she was, as it were, projected back in time. People thought that she was a much more ancient person than she was, and legends were told about her, how she was the daughter of a mortal and a god. Of course, that's very common in ancient mythology. How she married a great king, how she was brought up by shepherds, etc., etc. When the Greeks were trying to work out the history of Nineveh, one of the things that concerned them was who was the founder of Nineveh. Well, they decided the founder of Nineveh had to be someone called Ninus, because Nin, Ever, and they thought this has to mean the city of Ninus. And so this completely fictional character called Ninus was created out of a sort of conflation of bits of different historical monarchs, and he was declared to be by certain Greek chroniclers the founder of Nineveh, and he was linked with Semiramis. There came to be the legend that Semiramis had been the wife of one of his generals. Ninus had wanted her, and so he had basically made his general commit suicide and married her. Now along then comes, in the early Christian centuries, a writer who is broadly speaking Christian, who writes something that's known as the Clementine Recognition. It's got nothing to do with anyone called Clement, but it was, like a lot of ancient literature, when it was anonymous, it was attributed to somebody who had actually nothing to do with it. It's written probably in about the 4th century AD, 4th century perhaps into the 5th century. And in this book, the Clementine Recognitions, the author, being from a Christian background, he knows about Nimrod, says, well, Ninus and Nimrod must be the same person. And so the two are identified. And that brings us back to Alexander Hislop. Hislop was a man who'd been a school teacher. He had a smattering of the knowledge of the classics. He'd been a journalist. He'd followed with some interest the explorations in the Far East, in the Middle East rather, or as it was known then, the Near East. The early excavations in places like Nineveh and Babylon. But also he was, like a lot of Scots Presbyterians of his day, a violent opponent of Roman Catholicism. Now, the normal arguments against Roman Catholicism engage with the actual writings and teachings of Roman Catholicism. But Hislop came up with what he thought, it seems, was a brand new idea. It wasn't entirely new. There had been some ideas beforehand, some notes that some of the imagery, the ritual of Roman Catholicism might have some kind of connection with the ancient pagan past. It is known, for example, that the Pope's title of Supreme Pontiff is carried over from the ancient Roman emperors. That some of the imagery, the Virgin and Child, may have some connection with ancient pagan imagery, although of course a woman nursing a child, then there's only a certain number of ways you can draw that or mould that. But there came to be this idea that there was some kind of connection. And what Hislop does is he says, Roman Catholicism is nothing more or less than ancient Babylonian mystery religion dressed up in Christian clothes. Now, there's only really one way to describe such a concept, and that is that it is complete and total nonsense. The thing is that there's no such thing as ancient Babylonian mystery religion. The religion, Babylonian religion, that Hislop presents never existed. It is a conflation of all kinds of pagan symbolism and ideas from all over the world, from Egypt and China, and from all over history. And he loves to make these great connections. If this, then that, then the other thing, then, and therefore. There's a whole chain of supposition. He writes, in leading proof of the Babylonian character of the papal church, the first point to which I solicit the reader's attention is the character of mystery, which attaches alike to the Roman, to the modern Roman and the ancient Babylonian systems. But how broad is that? Well, mystery. It's a mystery that it's a mystery this book is still in print, actually. He says the Chaldean mysteries can be traced back to the days of Semiramis, who lived only a few centuries after the flood, and who was known to have impressed upon them the image of her own depraved and polluted mind. That beautiful but abandoned queen of Babylon was not only herself a paragon of unbridled lust and licentiousness, but in the mysteries, which she had a chief hand in forming, she is worshipped as Rhea, the great mother of the gods. With such atrocious rites identified her with Venus, the mother of all impurity, and raised the very city where she had reigned to a bad eminence among the nations, as a grand seat at once of idolatry and consecrated persecution and consecrated prostitution. Thus was this Chaldean queen a fit and remarkable prototype of the woman in the Apocalypse. Now that is complete and unadulterated nonsense. Semiramis had no connection with Babylon. Semiramis did not live only a few centuries after the flood. Semiramis had nothing to do with the Chaldean mysteries, and we might go on. Every word of that paragraph is false. But that is the kind of proof that he gives. Again he says, from Zonaras we find that the concurrent testimony of the ancient authors he consulted was to this effect. For speaking of arithmetic and astronomy, he says, it is said that these came from the Chaldees to the Egyptians and thence to the Greeks. If the Egyptians and Greeks derived their arithmetic and astronomy from Chaldea, seeing these in Chaldea were sacred sciences and monopolized by the priests, that is sufficient evidence they must have derived their religion from the same quarter. So it all begins with hearsay, it has been said, and then it comes to this conclusion. This is not how you build a meaningful or coherent or even half-sensible argument. He speaks of the mother goddess. The original of that mother, so widely worshipped, there is reason to believe was Semiramis. There is no reason to believe was Semiramis. If that is the case, then the whole argument collapses, and nonsense. His own confusion concerning ancient mythology he does not recognise, but imagines that his confusion must therefore mean that the mythology itself is confused, not that his sources are confused. He, for example, writes, this also accounts for the origin of the same confusion of relationship between Isis and Osiris, the mother and child of the Egyptians. There is no such confusion. No Egyptologist is confused about this. Osiris is the brother and the husband of Isis in Egyptian mythology. Their son is Horus. There is no such confusion. The confusion exists only in his own mind. And when an author who is himself confused does not recognize his confusion, then he confuses his own readers. He goes on. When we turn to Egypt, we find remarkable evidence of the same thing there also. Justin, as we have already seen, says that Ninus subdued all nations as far as Libya and consequently Egypt. The statement of Diodorus Siculus to the same effect is to the same effect, Egypt being one of the countries that, according to him, Ninus brought in subjection to himself. But Ninus never existed. This would be like somebody taking Geoffrey of Monmouth. Now, Geoffrey of Monmouth's great. Geoffrey of Monmouth is wonderful. But Geoffrey of Monmouth is not history. Geoffrey of Monmouth, of course, is famous for his statements about King Arthur and Merlin. But according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, King Arthur conquered Rome. Who believes that today? Nobody. Because we recognise that Geoffrey of Monmouth is reporting mythology and legend. He's not reporting history. The same is true of Diodorus. So you cannot make this connection. And again, we have this wonderful thing to do with the Egyptian god Khons, with horns. Khon, we find that the name of the third person in the primeval triad of Egypt was Khons. But Khons in Egyptian comes from a word that signifies to chase. Therefore the name of Khons, the son of Maut, the goddess mother, who was adorned in such a way as to identify her with Rhea, the great goddess mother of Chaldea, properly signifies the huntsman or god of the chase. As Khons stands in the same relation to the Egyptian Maut as Ninus does to Rhea, how does this title of the huntsman identify the Egyptian god with Nimrod? Now this very name Khons, brought into contact with Roman mythology, not only explains the meaning of a name in the pantheon there that hitherto has stood greatly in need of explanation, but causes the name, when explained, to reflect light back on this Egyptian divinity, and to strengthen the conclusion already arrived at. The name to which I refer is the name of the Latin god Consus, who was in one aspect identified with Neptune, but is also regarded as the god of hidden counsels, or the concealer of secrets, who was looked upon as the patron of horsemanship and said to have procured the horse. Who could the god of hidden counsels, or the concealer of Saturn be, or secrets be, but Saturn, the god of the mysteries, and whose name, as used at Rome, signified the hidden one? What a load of tosh. I'm sorry, this is just drawing connections. Well, of course, it must, but it's all sleight of hand, it's all smoke and mirrors. This whole book is smoke and mirrors. Be very careful with smoke and mirrors. One of the more unpleasant aspects, there's several unpleasant aspects about this book, one of them is that Hislop was, to put not too fine a point on it, something of a racist. I already noted, he says, that Nimrod, as the son of Cush, was a Negro. Now there was a tradition in Egypt, recorded by Plutarch, that Osiris was black, which in a land where the ordinary complexion was dusky must have implied something more than ordinary in its darkness. And of course he then goes that there is something unnatural about the black Nimrod having the white Semiramis as wife. Very unpleasant. All very unpleasant. But he goes on to say, we have unequivocal evidence that Osiris, son and husband of the great goddess queen in Egypt, was also represented as a veritable Negro. And this is it. Doing. This chap here. Yes, bad picture. One could go on. There is so much here that is saying because X looks a bit like Y, then it must be that thing. But there is no such reason to imagine that. Speaking of in regard to the pagan character of the unbloody sacrifice of the Mass, we have seen not little already, but there is something else to be considered. He goes on to say, the letters on the wafer that are worth reading, the letters are I, H, S. To a Christian, these letters are represented as signifying Jesus hominum salvator, Jesus the Saviour of men. The reality is they're the first three letters of Jesus in Greek. They're not Latin letters at all. They're not IHS. They are iota, eta, and sigma. Yes. But let a Roman worship of Isis. For the age of the emperors there were innumerable worshippers of Isis in Rome. Cast his eyes upon them, and how will he read them? He will read them, of course, according to his own well-known system of idolatry. Isis, Horus, Seb. That is the mother, the child, the father of the gods. In other words, the Egyptian Trinity. Again, this is tosh. The Egyptians had triads, not trinities. And the Egyptian triad was Isis, Osiris, Horus. Isis, Horus, Seb doesn't exist in any Egyptian myth. The idea of wafer cakes with these letters on is a figment of his imagination. He is taking Roman Catholic worship practices and saying, how can I claim that this is pagan? And that is a lie. He deals with the Christmas and the goose. The goose. The goose. In many countries we have evidence of a sacred character attached to the goose. The goose. What a silly goose. Pagans worshipped gods many and lords many. And every animal was sacred to some deity or another. The fact that one enjoys roast beef does not make one a Hindu. In fact, of course, a sacred animal isn't eaten in many religions. And ultimately, as well as the fact that this book is a tissue of nonsense, a farrago of rubbish and lies, there is a greater problem. That it is completely pointless and meaningless. If I am to deal with Roman Catholic teaching, I am to deal with Roman Catholic teaching. Not to say, well, this looks a bit like that. Or I can make some far-fetched connections. But no, we deal with what people believe, teach, and confess. May we, as Christians, remember this. May we deal fairly with those with whom we differ. And may such works as this be cast to the moles and the bats where they belong. And a Merry Christmas to all of you at home. Thank you for watching.